And the evolutionary upward scale of racism starts with bigotry, which is basically name calling, racial slurs, uttering hurtful speech. But it's words. But then it goes from bigotry to intolerance, where in addition to the attitudes and values held, harboring disdain for members of another race, intolerance also would have an individual refuse to be in the presence of persons of a race that he loathes or discriminates against. But then it goes to xenophobia, which is actually fear of persons of another race. Then to ethnocentrism. So from bigotry, intolerance, and xenophobia, ethnocentrism gets to the stage where one is actually of a confirmed belief in the superiority of one's own race and the inferiority of the race that they're discriminating against, which takes us to prejudice. Now, prejudice is prejudgment, without facts, without proper information, without a fair trial, but really as a result of misperception or misrepresented misunderstanding about a people's culture or a people themselves who we have limited knowledge of, and decisions are made in that capacity. That prejudice is a forerunner to the sixth stage, which is segregation and stratification, as was manifested in South Africa, apartheid, where you now actually construct social systems that are upheld by political power and held firmly in place by legal constitutional arrangements that deny and restrict persons access to power and privilege because of their race. And then it gets to level number 7, which is again a phrase that was coined by Kwame Ture, which is institutionalized racism. Institutionalized racism is when the bigotry, intolerance, xenophobia, ethnocentrism, prejudice, stratification, and segregation all become institutionalized to the point where they are set in motion as a system and continue to refuel and regenerate themselves, even in the absence of any racist person, as part of the autonomous hierarchy or human resource management or administration of the corporation that is practicing institutionalized racism. So you see, for bigotry and intolerance and xenophobia and prejudice to take place, you have to have racist people. But for institutionalized racism to occur, that is so deep that you could even have persons who are interested in fighting against racism, but you place them in part of the system and they will perpetrate the same racism that they in their own minds might be trying to fight against. Take the conscious young black person who gets a job in a bank as a loans officer, and he or she knows that the culture of the financial institution that they're a part of is to not refuse any white people from any loans or grants, period. And to be very skeptical and cautious about giving loans to African businessmen for business ideas. Now, you may be sitting listening to some white man talking about some crazy, insane business idea that he wants funding for, but the bank that you're working for has never refused any white people. Go back to the research of Professor Selwyn Ryan. Go to my YouTube channel, and I did a video on how economic institutionalized racism works, and I used those statistics from Professor Selwyn Ryan, who said that white people in Trinidad, even though they're only 1% of the population, they comprise 36% of those who approach the banks for loans, and they are 100% successful. African people, on the other hand, who are 50% of the population, make up 27% of those who approach the banks for loans, but only 66% of them are successful. Those are the facts that Professor Selwyn Ryan published in his book on the black entrepreneurship experience in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, if you are a young, vibrant, conscious, action-oriented young person, you get a job in the banking sector as a loans officer. As far as you're concerned, your job is to reproduce that narrative, that history. So you give the white people the loans. That's institutionalized racism. Could be the police officer who has joined an institution where there is a culture of racial profiling and stereotyping of young black men, and also the refusal to charge young white boys who are found with cocaine and heroin and illegal firearms because of who their parents are. You're aware of some unwritten law within your institution. No, we can't arrest them. We can't charge them. And you're just going along with the culture of it. That's when it becomes institutionalized. But in addition to those 7 levels of racism, you also have aversive racism, laissez-faire racism, and colorblind racism. So aversive racism is when you hold a view or an opinion where you either consciously or subconsciously perpetually avoid interaction with someone because of their race or ethnicity. Then you have laissez-faire racism, just like in Principles of Business and Sociology, they talk about laissez-faire leadership. Laissez-faire racism is a kind of laid back or passive, non-active racism, where there's a subtle, clear negative bias against people of African descent in particular, tendency to blame the victims of racism for their problems without saying it is because they're black, and a persistent negative bias and a clear resistance to policy reforms such as affirmative action. And then colorblind racism is very similar to laissez-faire racism. Colorblind racism is characterized by the convenient ignoring or disregarding of the reality of racism, taking the position that the problem of racism will be solved if we ignore it. That is a classical vision, classical type of racism in Trinidad and Tobago. Colorblind racism or laissez-faire racism. We pretend it doesn't exist. And we throw all of these smoke screens. But we all play carnival together. And all races go to the beach together. And all races go to the fete together. So what's the problem? There's no racism here. But you don't look at the bank. You don't look at the boardroom. You don't look at the multi-million-dollar contracts. You don't look at the local white privilege. You don't look at the freedom from being prosecuted in the courts, such as